Hey everybody, today I am here with Yates Sexton, the author of The Midnight Kingdom, which I've been reading and thinking about, along with many other things. And yeah, it doesn't exactly tell a happy story. But before we get into the story that it does tell, Jared, you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and kind of how you got into writing this particular book?
Yeah, I've had a weird 8 years. So back in 2016, I was just sort of a creative writer, a fiction writer who had an interest for politics. I'd worked in politics, covered politics in the past, and I had this failed novel, so I decided I was going to cover the 2016 campaign. And I ended up going to Trump rallies and started screaming to anybody who would listen to me that something really, really wrong was growing within the MAGA movement. And I was sort of thrown into the deep end of the pool very, very quickly. And so I had to change my understanding of history and politics as conditions were changing. And so as a result, over the past 8 years, I've been covering the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, Christian nationalism, conspiracy theory culture, all of that, simply as I've tried to keep a pace with what's going on. So as a result, I've ended up writing multiple books. One was covering the 2016 campaign, how Trump came to power. Another was focusing and criticizing the idea of traditional masculinity and how it's played into neo-fascistic culture. I reconsidered American history in my book American Rule and realized the authoritarian elements that have always been there. And the Midnight Kingdom was a broader subject to sort of trace the lines of power in so-called Western civilization to understand how we've reached this point and how these conspiracy theories and narratives and nationalistic and religious mythologies have contributed to all of this. So basically, I'm a work in progress that is trying to keep a pace with this.
So yeah, it sounds like a really strong through line since 2016. I mean, I noticed in I keep wanting to say Midnight's Children or something. But the Midnight Kingdom. You talk a little about your grandmother and your family background and so on. Can you just remind me and maybe tell viewers a little bit of did you come from a sort of Christian American kind of background in a way, or?
Yeah, unfortunately, I grew up in a very, very rural, poor, conservative Indiana town area in a Christian. How do I put this? A Christian culture that was very cultish, and very, very extremist with elements of white nationalism and conspiracy theory culture. Some really, really extremist ideology that, unfortunately, when things started really falling apart in the last few years, it was very recognizable. It was very familiar because even going back into the 1980s and into the 90s, my family and my community and my church, all of it were absolutely steeped in all of these things. So I was able to escape that and eventually find my way out of it and find a way to understand it. But I unfortunately was raised up within a lot of these principles and ideas.
Okay. And yeah, so had you been covering these topics in your fiction also, or was this just like a big swerve?
Well, no, in my fiction, a lot of what I was always covering was, and I didn't understand it for a while. Obviously, when you're a young artist, you're spending a lot of time looking at yourself, but not particularly understanding yourself. I was thinking about the men around me, the cultures I was raised in. A lot of men who were angry but didn't understand why they were angry, which has now become, an epidemic in this country. One of the reasons why our democracy is at stake is because you have a lot of people who do not understand themselves and don't understand their situation. So I was basically writing about this stuff before I started to realize the socioeconomic sort of consequences of it.
Right on. And I got the sense from your book that, I mean, I'm sure you're not voting for Trump. Obviously, you'll vote for Biden, but I didn't necessarily feel that you were that supportive of kind of the liberal progressive establishment. You were sort of critiquing. Am I correct about that? You were sort of critiquing how they kind of have helped let it get to this state in a way.
So one of my biggest critiques of what's actually happening right now is that for the past, I let's go ahead and be conservative with this. The last 40 years, if not going back into the late 70s, we've been dealing with a neoliberal consensus in this country. Basically, following World War II, we had the New Deal consensus, which was the idea that we needed a robust government that regulated, that kept businesses in check, but also made sure that the lives of the citizens were maintained or even improved, whether it was making sure their drinking water was safe or whether they could retire or weren't aren't going to fall into like penniless ruin. And what happened going into the 70s and the 80s was that neoliberalism, which is an ideology we can get into, there's a long history of how we got here and what it is and why it's doing what it is. Basically, in the 70s into the 80s, the Democratic Party realized very, very quickly that they were not going to compete with things like Reaganism or trickle-down economics. It simply wasn't going to happen. And as a result, the Democratic Party changed themselves almost in totality. They left behind their traditional power bases of labor unions, vulnerable communities, basically anyone that used to support them, and started to become Reaganism with a human face. And so what we have dealt with for the past 40 years was a consensus within the United States government of deregulation, privatization, the destruction of the social safety net. And now we've reached a point where that project has produced really ruinous circumstances. And so now we have, unfortunately, within the duopolistic system that we have a far right-wing fascistic party with the Republican Party, which is trying to usher in an era of authoritarianism through neoliberalism. And then you have the Democratic Party, which has largely been reduced to a conservative party, which is maintaining the institutions as they are, trying to protect what has been gotten as opposed to moving forward. So it isn't necessarily progressivism that I have a problem with. It's the project of liberalism, which I think has become the consensus for decades now, and unfortunately has led us to the spot that we're in.
Yeah, right. I mean, I sometimes think that, like, if Biden, all the Democrats are like, we have to fight to protect democracy, so we have to, we can't vote for Trump, we have to support Biden. And I was like, well, I mean, isn't that kind of like blackmail in a way? Because it's like, you're giving me one alternative, so how is that democratic? It's like either I vote, for fascism, or I vote for a sort of, simulacrum of democratic choice, where there isn't really any choice because they've stifled all the choice in a way.
Exactly. And I think and I want to be very, very clear about it. I've said this to anybody who's asked me. Like, I do plan on voting for Joe Biden in November. That is my own personal political choice. I am viewing it as voting for pressing the brake a little bit on the spread of authoritarianism, because to vote for Donald Trump or to have another Trump presidency is to and by the way, I want to make this clear before we go any forward any further. Donald Trump is a symptom of a larger disease. Right. He is not the brain man on this. He is not the one with the strategies. What we're actually dealing with is a very complicated, organized, well-financed, well-resourced push by oligarchical right-wing billionaires and donors in this country and corporatists. Donald Trump just so happens to be a really useful front man for that, because he creates a faux populistic movement, which I'm sure that we'll talk about at some point. What I keep saying, though, is that I do not think that voting for Joe Biden or elections at this point are what's going to save us. They can pause things. You can sort of like it's almost like if you're thinking about someone who is I always try and explain I've never actually descended down a mountain, like rappelled down a mountain, but you can like sort of you have a brake and you can go faster. And right now, the best choice is to hit the brake and try and change something outside of it. I think there has to be a new populist democratic movement that pressures the Democratic Party or creates an alternative to the Democratic Party. I do not think that elections are going to save us. I think it's going to take democratic energy, and I think that that's what history has shown us, is that you're not going to simply win this thing by voting and going to the booth. That is the absolute bare that is the least amount of democratic activity that you can engage in. That is the bare minimum, and there has to be more beyond that.
I've many thoughts, based on my own like thinking and research and everything you just like talked about. And I'm sure like, Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money. That was a great book that showed how, yeah, as you say, the far right oligarchs or plutocrats decided like way back in the 60s that they didn't like the direction of modern society towards liberalization and more social services. So they realized it was a long haul struggle. So they put together a group of funders, and then they went after it in a very deliberate way. I mean, she really does a great job in that book. So they were like, okay, we need, the left has, or has like grassroots movements where all these people are very inspired. We'll have to create astroturfed versions of those movements. the left has captured a lot of the, academic departments. So we're gonna have to create, we're gonna have to buy, like I think they bought the University of Chicago economics department and installed Milton Friedman. The left has all these like intellectuals that people rally around. So we need our own intellectuals. So they created like Charles Murray and funded him through like the Heritage Foundation. So then like these ideas that, minorities don't deserve social services because they're inherently less intelligent and have less capacity for advancement, sort of simmer through society, whether they're expressed explicitly or not. And I imagine since a lot of those people were also like Koch brothers, like fossil fuel people, I'm sure they also had deep ties to the military-industrial complex, which probably helped lead to psyops, various attempts to create psyops, whether that's QAnon over the last years, or even maybe some aspects of this whole UAP, UFO thing, and the way that's being used as perhaps a distraction mechanism. Well, that's like a much longer discussion. It's something I've written about a little bit. Okay, so one thing that fascinated me about your book was that you go all the way back. It's like a huge history lesson. I hadn't anticipated that. So why don't you take us back through your thinking process and why you felt it was important to go back to like Rome and up to Napoleon and then Illuminati and the whole thing.
Well, I because I'm really excited to get into all of these, and I want to touch on something because anybody who's listening to this, what we're actually talking about is like it's an interconnecting groups of self-serving interests, right? Which is one of the reasons why capitalism is what capitalism is it directs a lot of different people to do things that work in concert with each other. What we're not having a discussion about is smoke-filled rooms. We're not talking about groups that are like meeting, at Bohemian Grove and coming, although, some of them do meet at a Bohemian Grove and some of them do have some really nefarious plans. So what we're actually talking about is not necessarily a unified theory of things. It's more about the evolution of what you were just getting into, which is the powerful who are using narratives and are using attacks on reality in order to pursue their own interest, which is power and profit, which in all of what we're talking about is logical, right? That's how this system has been set up. That's how this system works. That's how this system has done all of it. So what I want to say, first of all, is I went back to Rome because as a person who was raised up in evangelicalism, I never understood how Christianity took over the Roman Empire. I had no idea because it didn't make sense to me, right? You had this group that was, of course, being oppressed and being basically killed and martyred at all times. It never made sense to me how that happened. And whenever I kind of do that, and I'm sure you're like this too, whenever I start asking questions, and this maybe has more to do with the neurodivergency of myself, I always end up asking the question before the question that I asked. And if I let myself go, I keep going and going and going. And I was like, well, I want to go back to the start of so-called Western civilization. And what I found from the very beginning, going back to Rome, and this was incredible, we're talking about Christians in catacombs, right? We're talking about Christians being absolutely oppressed in this society. Daniel, that's where the QAnon narratives came from. Because what were the Christians doing in the catacombs? They were sacrificing children for secret powers, right? They were abusing children. Those were the rumors about them, and that's what allowed, the powerful to go after them and oppress them. And immediately, what I realized was it wasn't that QAnon had its origins there. It's that there are stories that continue in a cyclical nature that humanity keeps telling itself. And these stories eventually are sort of acted upon by the powerful when they realize it's incredibly useful for maintaining the power that they have and gaining more power, right? Because one of the things that happens when you're powerful, you're responsible for what's happened, right? Like you are the one who is making decisions. You're the one who's guiding society. Take, for instance, a Donald Trump as president, who promised all of his supporters he was going to drain the swamp, he was going to build the wall, correct? Well, why is the swamp not drained? Why is the wall not built? Why are these lies not coming true? And opposed to them being bad faith lies, there's a simple alternative. The deep state kept him from doing it, right? And what I figured out was there's always a nugget of truth in these stories because, to be frank, there is a deep state. You had brought up the military-industrial complex. We're talking about oligarchs and plutocrats who are working behind the scenes beyond, the consequences of representative government. There is something that, like, makes sure that things keep going the same way, regardless of whether George W. Bush is in office or Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden. There's stuff that's behind the scenes, which is the administrative state, which has been built. But these stories take the onus off of these things. So, for instance, in Rome, why is stuff going to hell in Rome? Why is the empire in decline? It couldn't possibly be the emperor. The emperor is a godlike figure. It has to be conspiracies. It has to be the Christians who are doing this. It has to be this group that is doing this. Eventually, though, what ends up happening, and this is one of the reasons why Christianity has been woven through the history of capitalism and power, and particularly white supremacy, there is a double sort of it's almost like a weapon against cognitive dissonance. There's a martyrdom, but there's also a righteousness, right? God is on my side. I get to do what I want. At the same time, I'm always going to be discriminated against, and as a result, I should do anything in my power to protect myself. And that ideology has been woven through so-called Western civilization, white supremacy, and also capitalism the entire time, which is why we keep seeing these cycles play themselves out through the ages, regardless of what century we're in, what country we're in, what culture we're in. These things are constants, and that's what we're watching again at this moment.
Okay. So yeah, so what did you discover? So you discovered that the origin of Christianity had to do with so they had the scapegoat of Christians. Then at a certain point, how did the scapegoats become the core element of the new structure?
Well, so what I noticed, and it took me a while to sit with this. I started to realize that at the core of any moment, there is sort of a gravity of I'm putting air quotes around this for anyone listening to it, a gravity of a chosen reality, right? Like, so for instance, in the United States of America, the sort of binding reality that has kept everything sort of in order is the American dream, which is the idea that we are a society where people can work their way up to the top. They can have better lives, right? They can have more and more safety. And on top of that, they were born into a special country, right? That was chosen by God or the universe or fate or history to do things. As long as the gravity of that reality is strong, like there's usually like not a lot of discord. There's some fighting, there's some disagreements, there's some political infighting, but eventually at some point when the gravity of that reality starts to lose its power, you start to see more and more disruptions, right? You start to see a lot of fights. You start to see wars, genocides. You start to see democracy and liberal democracy at stake. Eventually, you either have to reinforce that old reality or you have to replace it with a new one. In Rome, the reality was that the emperors were gods, right? They were the main gods on earth, and as a result, they couldn't be wrong. Their direction was perfect. The Roman Empire was everlasting. It was never going to be challenged. When there started to be civil war, there started to be infighting between, potential emperors or, even warlords between themselves. That reality starts to fall apart and it needs to be replaced by something. And instead of replacing it with an imperial cult, it merged with Christianity. And all of a sudden now you have an almighty monotheistic God that has all of these elements that you can use in order to rule, in order to have legitimacy, and in order to basically do whatever you want. So it was the replacement of one reality with another, which is where we're at now. The American dream, the idea of American exceptionalism, these things are starting to fall apart. They need to be replaced by something else. And the battle is over what's going to replace it, what comes next. And what we see in these cycles is sort of it's the conflict over what reality is going to replace the old reality.
I was thinking a little bit about Rene Girard. Do you know his stuff at all?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this whole thing about the scapegoat mechanism and mimetic violence. Somehow he's now been very much, I think he was quite right wing and also Christian. But in a way, the scapegoat or the martyr is like the necessary figure for society somehow to sort of reconstitute itself or something. Kind of a scary thought, I guess.
Well, and I want to point something out on that note because something you're bringing up is really important, which is I think the right fundamentally understands this more than the left, which is actually really, really interesting when you take a look at history, which is
By the way, left is a complicated term. When you say left, I mean, we have the
absolutely.
progressive.
Well,
Which
and
left?
I'm glad you said that.
like anarchist, basically, who, so I consider myself pretty far left, but I don't
So you and
consider,
I would make this argument. I think that you and I are sufficiently leftist,
yeah,
but
okay, fair
I
enough.
think people need to understand that like we throw around the left so
Yeah,
much. We say the leftist New York Times and it's a corporate lens for reality, which is wild. MSNBC is a corporate company that goes through a corporate lens, and people say leftist MSNBC, where the left wants this or the left wants that. To be specific, the left was decimated, absolutely destroyed over the past century. They were hunted down by multiple state-run agencies. They were undermined economically and culturally. The left basically doesn't even exist anymore. And that's
right.
part of the issue. It's starting to grow a little bit, but it doesn't have any fundamental power. Like in America, there is no leftist party. There are barely any leftist politicians or anybody who could even be qualified as center of left. But I do think that's part of the issue, is that the left in a lot of ways has been relegated to theory and relegated to sort of I think sort of logically trying to eat around at the margins, or thinking that maybe you're going to talk sense to people in a lot of senses, when in fact the right has understood the power of narrative. Right. One of the most influential right-wing philosophers right now is Harry Jaffa, who is behind all of these like right-wing think tanks and institutes and MAGA, America First groups. And Jaffa basically was one of these people who was just like, you need the noble lie, which is a Plato idea, right? Which is, you just need a story, and you need a story that people can believe and that they can gather around and they can have faith in. That's one of the issues we have now, is that the right is gaining power because they're telling a story. It's absolutely incoherent. It makes no sense. It's a complete and utter fraud, but it's a story that people can get behind, as opposed to means testing or tax credits or qualified federal debt relief. Nobody cares about that. Nobody actually believes in any of that. They need a story that they need to insert themselves in, and the right understands that fundamentally for a lot of different reasons. And it goes back to what you were talking about. Like, there's one right wing or right wing adjacent philosopher after another who is talking about the story doesn't need to be real. There just needs to be a powerful story that organizes society. And the right understands that in the way the left has had a real problem with.
Right. I mean, I guess also even among the right, there's kind of, I mean, there was George Bush, kind of
Yep.
rock-ribbed Republicans or whatever who, were okay with a certain level of, democratic choice.
Mhm.
And now there's this new group which has kind of recognized that simply like demographically, as the society becomes more pluralistic, they have to, intervene essentially illegally to maintain white power and privilege.
Yeah, and I want to go back very quickly to the first Bush, H.W. Bush. H.W. Bush was a technocrat and part of the military-industrial complex that we've already talked about. He was the beginning of the neoliberal consensus, but he still had a little bit of the New Deal consensus in him, right? Like he still, basically he didn't get up and talk about like ethno-nationalism, or he didn't call into question the institutions. You get to W. Bush, same thing, which is one of the reasons why you still see these really, really disgusting moments with like Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and W. Bush hanging out, even though, he's a war criminal. Like, what has happened now? And our idea in America of conventional politics and history is so shallow and so thin that people don't understand how fundamentally our politics have changed. So what has happened, and everybody likes to pretend the GOP is some sort of very, very disciplined group, right? That they're just all on the same page, they all want the same things. There has been a civil war within the GOP. And what has happened is that establishment Republicans, such as a Mitch McConnell, right, that these establishment Republicans have more or less been pushed to the margins by a new authoritarian GOP. And here's what the new GOP offers: it offers a critique of neoliberalism while also going ahead and pushing neoliberalism. It's an ingenious thing, right? It started with the Tea Party, which was astroturfed, going back to our discussion earlier about the oligarchs and plutocrats. Provided a critique of the system that they were aiding, and that they have now created a faux populistic movement, which is actually on behalf of the same oligarchs and plutocrats who have caused the problems in the first place. And they've now created a pseudo faux populistic movement that has replaced the old GOP. So it's not politics as usual. Even going back to the second Bush, things have so fundamentally changed since then that this old sort of analysis and understanding of all of it is not just lazy, but it's actually destructive. I don't think most people understand what has actually happened in American politics up to this point.
When you say they've reconstituted or they're continuing neoliberalism, can you be a little more specific? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So one of the things that's happened, and to go ahead and do this, I want to broaden it out a little bit. The beginning of globalism was this moment where the American empire created a global structure of trade and politics. And again, like people, we have to use some old outdated terms: first world, second world, third world, right? We created this structure where America was up on top of a pyramid, right? And we were going to get the benefit of all of it. We were going to get the resources, the cheap goods. We were also going to go ahead and export the labor so that the wealthy wouldn't have to pay minimum wages or benefits or anything. They would pay pennies on the dollars for second and third world countries to go ahead and manufacture these things.
Which we
Meanwhile,
did. This all happened, obviously.
oh yeah, no, this absolutely happened. And then the second and third world countries were used for their labor, used for their resources, and everything went up to the top of the pyramid. Unfortunately, to keep countries in that second and third world category, it relied on authoritarianism. You had to fix their elections, you had to take away their rights, you had to break labor unions, you had to make sure that human rights weren't important. Sometimes you had to support a dictator or warlord. You had to go ahead and give them money and weapons and support. The problem in all of this, and by the way, we'll go ahead and bring this around to Foucault because you have to. There's the boomerang idea, which is the idea that when you export these things, that those second and third world countries, when you take away people's rights, when you mistreat them or you accept warlords or dictators, eventually the action comes around to the country that started it in the first place. And we've seen this throughout history in cycles. Neoliberalism has always been authoritarianism with a mask. Free markets. Well, we're not doing this. The market's doing this. It's not about us. Eventually, it gets to the point where it comes back around to the host country, which is, we saw this with Great Britain with the rise of corporations, including the slave trade and colonialism, right? Eventually, the corporations took over Great Britain and sort of plundered it for parts and ruined the rights of the people. That's where we're at now. And we've reached a point where this progress, quotes around progress, this progress of neoliberalism requires that America loses its democratic features. It requires the total takeover of representative government. And and quite frankly, we're reindustrializing right now. And if we're going to do that, we're not going to pay people minimum wages. We're not going to pay them benefits. We're not going to make sure that regulation is going to be in place. So you have to embrace, for lack of a better word, the whip. You have to create a situation in which there is a strong authoritarian bent that is no longer hidden. And what's happening with MAGA, the America First, whatever you want to call it, the new right, what they're doing is, in bad faith, they're providing a critique of neoliberalism while going ahead and very, very quietly and sometimes aggressively putting into position a new authoritarian version of neoliberalism. So what they're doing is, on behalf of the wealthy who have already benefited from this, they're taking the onus away from the people that have caused it, the oligarchs, the plutocrats, and they're putting it on their political enemies, right? It's going to be labor unions. It's going to be people of color. It's going to be women. It's going to be LGBTQ Americans. Basically, and this is how things have always worked, they're going to go ahead and say that these people betrayed the nation. And as a result, there needs to be a crackdown and a new sort of strong hand to put that in place. And that is how this has always worked, whether it was in those second world countries, those third world countries. The process is now playing itself out again in the United States. So actually, they've created, like I said, a faux populistic movement that takes the onus off the people who have actually done this and gives them more power and takes away the democratic representation that has been promised up to this point.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, I guess things that I've been reading and thinking about recently. I'm doing these online courses.
Mm-hmm.
The next one we're doing, I guess in some ways it's kind of like a nascent effort, to address some of the things you're talking about. It's called Embracing Our Emergency. So we're trying to figure out, like, I'm working with this Josh Fox, who directed Gaslands, and we have like Bill McKibben and Marianne Williamson, and I think Jane Fonda is going to speak. we're trying to figure out how to kind of like reset, like reposition what's happening so that people don't feel so despondent and you know, but you know, so I've been reading a few books. What, you know, this guy John Michael Greer?
No, I don't. I'm not familiar.
He was like the former archdruid of America. He wrote a book called, but he's a very, I think he's actually very interesting and worth checking out. He wrote a book called Dark Ages America.
Mm,
Also, this guy Chris Martenson, who wrote a book called Crash Course, who's you know, so basically their arguments. I mean, there's a bunch of other authors in this area. I mean, there was like the peak oil movement, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, Richard Heinberg and James Howard Kunstler. And then basically what happened, and they were all predicting that around like 2012, 2013, like oil production was going to plummet. But obviously what happened is that we discovered, more conventional forms of extraction, hydrofracking and tar sands, which has allowed actually the US to become the world's, I think, #1 exporter of fossil fuels at this point again. But those are also, running out, and they're incredibly environmentally destructive and require a lot more energy inputs. So in any event, fossil fuels are a non-renewable finite resource, as are a lot of the other resources on the planet. Rare metals, all the stuff that we need to build the cars and the computers. All that stuff is getting harder and harder to access.
mm-hmm.
And in fact, China has kind of beaten us to the punch by holding on, creating the pipelines for those minerals in the future. So I mean, so Greer believes that we're heading into a, inevitable, sort of downslope of decline, where there's just not as much cheap energy. And then also going along with that is what's happening with, global warming, climate change, and how that's affecting, agriculture in particular, but also the availability of fresh water. So you have these, I mean, droughts that are making parts of the country unlivable. You have the Colorado River, which is like the huge, agriculture supplier for, California, basically out of water. You have these aquifers being pumped dry. And, there really doesn't seem to be long-range planning around this stuff. So it's like, I see Trump in that, and you didn't really get into this aspect of, you mentioned climate change a little bit, but in a way, Trump, who's lived on massive debt his whole life, is just, he's like the avatar of, we're just going to keep this thing going despite any, drag or any reality. We're somehow, going to, so yeah, I'm curious, if that resonates with you or what kind of your perspective. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad. Listen, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while because there's some stuff that like most people don't want to get into that is at the heart of this, right? Yeah. And I want to go ahead and start with something, which is that neoliberalism, instead of providing solutions for these things, provides market opportunities. So like as the country is running out of water, or while there are going to be parts of the country that are uninhabitable, that actually creates sort of segmented marketed opportunities. So I always use this opportunity. And by the way, the week that we're talking about this, it now has an even more disturbing aspect to it, right? I always say that neoliberalism can be boiled down like this. It's like what's happened on an airplane, where you now have these sort of segmented parts of the plane that, like, if you pay extra, you don't have to go through the misery of boarding the way that they expect, right? Or I don't know, maybe you can actually bring a bag on the plane if you can afford to do that, right? So if you pay more, what you're actually paying for is to be isolated from the misery of what it is to travel on a plane now, right? Well, now all of a sudden we're looking at like one of the major plane producers that their planes are falling out of the sky, right? Their parts are falling off constantly. And instead of the system saying, hey, we're not going to allow Boeing to fly anymore and we're going to do a massive investigation, like neoliberalism says, hey, this is an opportunity. You can go ahead and offer those flights, the dangerous flights, for less money. You'll make profit from that, and you can go ahead and charge more for the flights that aren't falling apart. Like neoliberalism works that way, and that's the way it approaches global climate change. The reason why we're not able to conceive of climate change, the reason why we're not even able to come to a consensus on it, we're not able to create something, the only way to address global climate change is a critique of the institutional systems. That's it. You literally have to go ahead and uproot things and imagine something different. And that's going to lead to a redistribution of wealth and power. There's no other way around it. Neoliberalism will not allow it. This is where Trump comes in. And this is why Trump is so important. And I think that this is the fundamental thing that is happening right now. Trump is an abusive person. Period. There's no other way to put it. Trump makes fun of his enemies, whether or not they have disabilities or whether he thinks they're weak. He's a misogynist. He's racist. He's xenophobic. We could list all these things all day long. What Trump actually does is something that's really, really wild, Daniel, that we haven't seen before, which is instead of John F. Kennedy's, like, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, which is asking more of the citizenry, he's asking less. He's actually telling the citizens, you don't have to change anything. In fact, you're not racist, you're not sexist, you're not selfish, you're not any of those things. Those people over there are lying and they're doing it to get one over on you. That's different. That is a change in American political rhetoric. It's always sort of been there with the Republicans, but the fact that it's so overt at this point is wild. What we actually need to do, unfortunately, is we need a cultural introspection. We need to recognize that, like, we have been greedy and we've been destructive and we've been racist, we've been sexist, we've been xenophobic. Like, all of these things have contributed to a not just cultural, political, and economic problems, but now we're talking about an existential problem. The American empire is one of the biggest drivers of global climate change. The capitalism that America has spread around the world, one of the biggest drivers of climate change. In order to address climate change, we would have to address ourselves. We would have to change ourselves. People like Trump, first of all, tell us we don't have to change ourselves, and second of all, abuse us to the point where we don't have an imagination for something better, which is what abusers do. What abusers do to make sure that they keep people in their place is they demean them, they humiliate them, and they tell them, you're unrealistic, you're absurd, this is ridiculous, nothing could be better. And the problem is that we have arrived where we no longer have an imagination for something different. I think it was Daniel Fisher. It says we could sooner imagine the apocalypse than we could the end of capitalism. Our imaginations have been destroyed. They've been eradicated, which is one of the reasons why American innovation is just absolutely falling apart. We were told that tech was going to save us, and what's happened to tech? Tech is just like regressing. Like, we all thought, it was going to lead us into the future, and now we're looking around, and it's like the innovation has just sort of stopped. We've seen it in medicine the exact same way. We have lost our ability to think outside of a paradigm. We've lost our ability to sort of innovate any way outside of the world that we have. And what we now have is we have a leader who is one of the most powerful people in the world who tells us we don't have to imagine anything new. We need to go into the past, retreat into the past. And actually, that's what you find with fascism, authoritarianism, right-wing authoritarianism. We've seen that over and over. It is always a rejection of the ability to think of anything that could change.
Now, obviously there's, this whole artificial intelligence thing is a kind of innovation. I interviewed recently an artist friend of mine, Warren Neidick, who wrote a book about what he calls cognitive capitalism, which I also found very interesting. And nobody can cover everything, but I'd be interested too. But I mean, one of his ideas that he introduced me to, I guess I'd already kind of had the idea, but it was made more palpable, is capitalism can only perpetuate itself because it has interest, and it sort of has to grow exponentially. So it constantly has to create new markets. And now there really aren't any more, we've covered every land and island with capitalism as much as we can.
There's one big one that we haven't.
Which is what?
China.
Okay, that's
but that's also part of what's going on right now too. I agree with you. That's right. Yeah.
But anyway, so the idea is that actually what's happening now is cognitive capitalism is going deeper into the brain, mind, cognitive capacity. So for instance, if you give a kid a smartphone at 10, so they have a GPS, during their whole childhood, like part of childhood is, playing with your friends, you go to the forest, you get lost, you have to find your way back, it's a little dangerous, but you learn how to spatially navigate. Now this whole generation of young people is not learning how to spatially navigate. So at a certain point, Google and Apple can just turn on a switch and be like, okay, now you have to pay us $10 a month, to navigate. Because apparently the hippocampus, which is where the sort of spatial navigation stuff happens, if that isn't developed when you're a teenager, it could never develop. you know, and the hippocampus is also linked to memory. Spatial recognition is linked to, like, there are these memory palaces where they would teach people how to remember all these languages by like creating a palace in your head or whatever. And similarly now with AI, they're taking our innate capacity to reason and to think and turning it into something that you just automate. So like instead of writing a piece about Shakespeare and Walter Benjamin, you say to the AI, look, write me an essay about Shakespeare and Walter Benjamin, it'll come up with something, you know. So it's sort of going deeper into our core cognitive capacities and actually changing our brain functionality, because once you've lost certain skills, it's not that easy to get them back, and sometimes you can't even, you know. So that's an interesting riff to put on this.
We could talk about that simple part of it, I think, for hours, but I want to point out a couple of things that goes along with that. One, artificial intelligence, it's actually really, speaking of stories, like the religious and faith-based idea that comes around it. We basically have these corporations and tech conglomerates that are programming artificial intelligence, right? They're the ones who are making sure what it does, how it thinks, how it processes things. And we're pretending like somehow or another it's some sort of like deity that's going to talk to us and solve our problems. When in fact, what's actually happening is it's being programmed to continue capitalism and all of these ideas, right? Which is, it's the Wizard of Oz idea. Like, we're very happy to not look behind the curtain because it will actually give liberalism the plausible deniability. And I want to go ahead very, very quickly give people an idea what this is going to look like. Think about right now with like the Democratic Party that can't pass Joe Biden's agenda because there's like a parliamentarian that says that they can't. And what do they do after they can't do it? They go out in front of the cameras and they say, we wish we could, but we just can't. Right? The parliamentarian said that we can't. We have a filibuster. We would totally do this if there wasn't a filibuster, right? We wish that we could do that. This actually, I think, in the future, when it comes to artificial intelligence, is going to change everything about politics and our economics. And people are going to say, man, I wish it was different. I really feel so bad that these jobs are being eliminated, that these people are being hurt, that state power is being used to oppress. But I mean, we're not in charge of this thing. I think that's one thing to remember. The next, I think when you take a look at all of this, what is actually happening is our society is so fundamentally changing that we've seen it before. We've had these major inventions, whether it was the printing press, right, which led to the schism between the Catholic Church and Protestantism. Like one of the biggest changes that we've actually seen, which has brought us here. You've had the radio, you've had television. I mean, the radio gave us the Nazis. Television gave us like basically a detached society. Now, all of a sudden, we have reached the point where capitalism and neoliberalism has so fundamentally changed our culture that we're almost unrecognizable. I am a firm believer in the term homo economicus, that like this system has changed us to the point where our the way that we think, the way that we live our lives has been so altered that it's almost impossible to totally understand it. I want to give a quick little representation of this. I didn't plan on coming on here to talk about Survivor, but I'm going to talk about Survivor, the reality TV show. This was happening right around the end of the millennium, and by the way, it's not an accident that it happened then. We have this reality show where people are put on an island, right, and they're supposed to create like a fake society, and it's a competition between them, right? And while they're doing that, they have a choice. They can create a society, an egalitarian society where they work together, or they can screw each other over. Well, guess what? We have interviews with the contestants. The guy who won was the guy who screwed everybody over, the absolute worst. If we were working with somebody like in our jobs back then and they would have like took us aside and been like, I'm screwing everybody over and I'm lying to people, I'm manipulating them, I'm taking advantage of them, we would have called them a sociopath, right? We would have like repelled from them in horror. We now expect that life is a game. This is one of the reasons why Donald Trump, a third-rate reality TV show host and con man, criminal for years who's ripped everybody off, has become so powerful. Because we now, in a society, we don't believe in egalitarianism. We don't believe that we can work together, right? Like I've been talking to you now for going on an hour. I think you're a good enough person. I think I'm a good enough person. I think we're acting in good faith. You're not going to suddenly jump out and screw me over. That's a form of intimacy, right? So as a result, we can have a conversation, we can share terms. But when you don't have that faith, when you think that everybody is out to screw you over, which is what neoliberalism does, it's like putting two scorpions in a glass jar and making them fight each other, right? That's what it does to us. We have created a society where not only can we not work together to create a different project or move ourselves forward or to repair any of the damage, we're now seeing these articles. I assume you probably saw it. These articles about influencer parents who are using their children to make money on Instagram or YouTube or TikTok or whatever it is. And they're understanding that not only are they exploiting their children, but there are predators who are like exploiting them, but they pay money. So you might as well do that. The fundamental bonds of human connection that are necessary for creating a better future, for cooperation, for working with one another, they've been dissolved. They've been, like, literally destroyed by everything that we're talking about, and the functions that you're talking about have been destroyed. We don't know where we're heading, but we have to have some sort of a sea change. We have to have some sort of a return to some type of value that isn't about, extraction, accumulation, exploitation. Like, those things have now become inherent in us. And I think that's what keeps us from being able to form political movements that can make change over time. And like what
Yeah.
we're discussing right now is only going to make that worse.
I mean, I think, I mean, we've been a little bit focusing on, let's say, the right wing aspect,
Yep.
but the problem is that I mean, there was a sense that like the sort of technologists were somehow like a new force in society that were somehow inherently a bit more progressive.
Yep.
But I guess over time that's been revealed as being fraudulent. I
Yep.
mean, Elon Musk has obviously, gone fully into the, MAGA realm, basically. Zuckerberg is just entirely about kind of protecting his, himself and his resources. I mean, Bill Gates, I think, sort of wants to do good in a way, but also is trapped in this, capitalist imperialist ideology that he doesn't, isn't able to perceive the limits of.
Well,
Uh,
and it's honestly it's a cult-like mentality is what it is. And I was disgusted. It was years back, and people don't like talking about this, but when Facebook first came around, when Elon Musk first came around, like you had Democratic senators, Congress people, and presidents just making like heart eyes at them. Just like putting their heads on their hands, just being like, how do you do it? Like they had no interest in regulating them. They had no interest in understanding what they were doing because they had a religious faith that those people were their people and that they were going to head and bring learning and logic to society. And as a result, things were going to get better. The problem, and this is the problem with liberalism writ large, is that there is a religious faith that although they believe in liberalism and rights and the idea of equality, deep down, they believe that, some pigs are created more equal than others. And the idea that like they if they could just educate the masses, and the masses probably they should have a vote, but they shouldn't have that much of a seat at the table. And we see that now. And we actually see that throughout history, which is one of the reasons why you see middle classes, particularly middle white classes, they're all for liberal democracy and direct representation until, the fire hits the road and all of a sudden they start siding with fascists and authoritarians. They wish that Hitler wouldn't say the things that he did. They wish that Benito Mussolini was just would chill out a little bit. But meanwhile, they made the trains run on time and they're pretty good corporatists. The problem is that the middle class is always in like a state of psychic panic and like existential terror, right? Like they want things to be better, but they also don't want their station to be troubled, right? Like they would be all for a better society, and they really would wish that people would be okay, which is one of the reasons I think that social media is so insidious. You can post about it. You can put it in your bio. You can share memes. You can do all those things. There's no downside to that. You're not putting yourself in danger. You're not doing any of those things. But meanwhile, the actual political action necessary doesn't have to happen. And I think that's one of the problems we've faced is that tech has given the illusion of progress when in fact what it's done is it's just sort of institutionalized the inherent inequalities and the oppression and the disruption of reality that we were talking about earlier. It's just forwarded those things under a new package that I think made it palatable to a lot of those lawmakers that we were talking about.
Yeah. I hear you on all of that. Yeah, I mean, and one reason the Democratic senators were shooting googly eyes at the tech guys is they were allowing for the religion of progress
Yes.
to, innovation. Like, that they kept that whole thing going for a while, and they're
Well,
still
and I just want to add one thing on that front because this was something I had to get into the Midnight Kingdom. What I realized was that the birth of liberalism was birthed in utopic ideology, right? And the idea,
stop, slow down a little bit. Is that like Thomas More and stuff like that, or like
yeah,
where are you
so
going?
like we're getting back to just a little bit before the Enlightenment, right? Like just as and this was back when the corporate structure was just sort of coming online and sort of taking over a lot of government, including Great Britain. As you take a look at this, what actually happens is capitalism and exploitation and settler colonialism, these things which are causing genocide, they're causing oppression, just untold problems, right? You're seeing a lot of what I would call proto-liberals who are all saying, this is really bad, but I promise you, we have a utopia in front of us. We're getting somewhere. Science is going to get us there. Progress is going to get us there. This is ugly right now, and we really wish it wasn't so bad. But if we can just get past this unpleasantness, I promise you, up over the hill, it's the promised land. And if we can just do this, we'll be fine. Which, by the way, is how they came to love Elon Musk. Well, I mean, he's not great, and yes, cars blow up and kill people, but he's going to get us to Mars. And yes, we have global climate change, and maybe we should keep him from extracting all these resources and basically destroying the environment. But if he can just put the foot on the gas a little bit faster, we'll get to Mars. I promise. It's a religious, secular idea, which is the thing. Like the right relies on actual religious ideology. Liberalism relies on secular ideology, secular religion. And so
No,
as
I
a
mean,
result,
yeah, like somebody like Bill Gates will always go back to the fact that, more people are living longer and healthier. And,
yes,
and obviously, I mean, Hannah Ritchie, who is the, scientist for Oxford's World in Data, just published a book called Not the End of the World that Bill Gates has been touting, where, she's basically, saying like, yeah, we have to keep having economic growth and, people eating less meat is good, but you don't really have to change your lifestyle that much. And, sort of like, the technocracy is still like going to figure it out, somehow,
well,
and
and I go ahead.
if you look at the history, there really has been a lot of progress, and there is, there is some truth to that. Whereas there are many more people on the planet, living longer, maybe they're not having, I don't know, I mean, I trip out on that a lot because I visited indigenous cultures in South America where I saw like these 80-year-old guys who were able to like climb up trees and like march on through the jungle for hours, and knew every plant in the jungle and so on. And in many ways, they seem to be having, much more amazing lives. But, I mean, infant mortality obviously is touted as one of the great achievements, or vaccines also, and all the stuff. What are you going to say?
Well, it's funny, by the way, that you ended that comment on infant mortality and vaccines because we're way back on that now. Like, you
Yeah,
know what I mean? Like that isn't even something the United States can talk about, nor is it education or length of life or any of it. And you brought up a lot of really, really good stuff that I think it would behoove us to get into very quickly. One, so-called Western civilization is based on the fallacy of we've already gone this far. Do you want to go back? You
yeah.
know, it's this idea, it's the best of all worlds. I used to live in this small college town in the South. It had like 6 or 7 restaurants. And there was like this one restaurant you went to where, I mean, it was a roll of the dice whether you were going to get food poisoning. You know, like every time you ate there, like it was really playing with fate. And we kept going back because where else were you going to go? You know what I mean? Like, are you going to drive to a different place? Are you going to try another place that's going to get you sick? And eventually, what you get told, it's limiting of imagination. It goes back to what we were talking about. And it turns out the technocracy, the liberal elite, whatever you want to call them, these people are being served by what's happened, right? Like, why would anybody, whether it's the media, the political class, or even like a billionaire like Bill Gates, why would any of them critique this system? it gave them what they have. It gave them the power they have, the wealth that they have. Also, going back to the idea of stories, it's intertwined their own personal narrative. Are you going to say that this system isn't fair that has raised you up? What's that say about you? Were you the beneficiary of privilege and chance and discrimination? No, you're not going to believe that. So what are you going to tell people? Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Come on, there's some things that need to be worked on, but whatever. That's what Western civilization is based itself on. But what you just brought up is really important. The basis of capitalism and Western civilization was the destruction of indigenous cultures. And before I wrote The Midnight Kingdom, I always had that old idea in my head that was why did Western civilization steamroll the indigenous cultures? And I always had that old narrative, well, they had better weapons, right? Or they were more advanced and they just came across these people. That's not why. They were able to do it because they deceived them, because they were more wicked and wretched and they betrayed them time after time after time, right? You actually look at these indigenous cultures that I was always told that they were primitive and silly and naive. They were full of, quote unquote, savages and barbarians. What you actually realize is that that right there is when Eve bit the apple. When we started like moving more towards the Western civilization type of mindset, which brings us into sociopathic behaviors, these inherent inequalities that forward perpetual inequality, what you realize is those indigenous cultures had it figured out. They actually figured out how to live egalitarian, good lives, and they had to be wiped from the face of the earth in order to make way for this severely unhealthy, abusive environment. And that's what we're dealing with. And people are still saying, well, I mean, it's the best it's ever been. Well, it could be something else. And we've lost that imagination to even imagine what that something else could be.
Yep. Sounds about right. Okay, so wait, I had another question. Oh, by the way, yeah, let's see. Well, in that case, where do you think we go from here? I mean, it's looking pretty, pretty bad. Oh, okay. This is also another thing I was going to ask you about, actually. So, but it seems like even the system, of control, domination, exploitation that's gotten us to this point. On the one hand, there's the environmental stuff, which sort of looks like the illusion of prosperity, is not, I mean, is not going to be able to maintain for too much longer, no matter what. And then, I mean, it's actually kind of interesting. New York City right now, the prices are skyrocketing. It's like the most expensive city in the world. Like you get a coffee and a croissant and you've dropped like $15 or something. I've never seen anything like it. But on the other hand, it feels like it's really deluxe. Like it feels like that, like a lot of money has come in from somewhere and rebuilt all the facades and everything. But if you look at like the graph of like the money supply expansion that the Federal Reserve has been doing, like the population graph, and like a few other really scary graphs, it's like an exponential graph that basically starting in 2008, when essentially the financial system died, we started quantitative easing, and the Federal Reserve just started pumping invented money into the system. So basically, if the system is has all these debts that if they don't get repaid, then the whole system starts to collapse. That's why it has to keep expanding, and there's no real place to expand anymore. The real world of mineral resources and food and goods and water has kind of reached its limit. How does that crash into reality? And when does that happen?
Well, I mean, both questions that you asked, I think, play into the exact same thing. Economics, it really watching it's like watching the tide. You know when it's getting high, and you know when it's going low. Like you can chart these things. It's the same story since capitalism came online. Everybody always says, I always get a kick out of this. So like, capitalism is easily the best system that we've ever had. And then they're like, hey, don't say anything bad about it. You'll spook it, and it will absolutely fall apart. Like, chill out, right? Like this thing's unstable. We've been tied to a bomb. And what always happens is we have these moments where we have the powerful and the wealthy that create vast record inequality. And as that happens, like you have like the 1%, 2% that have all this wealth. Everybody else is struggling, going paycheck to paycheck. But guess what? Here's the innovation: credit and debt, right? That all of a sudden now you're going to run up credit and debt. Well, eventually you run out of credit and debt. And eventually this entire thing falls apart. We've seen it happen. We watched it 16 years ago. It happened then, it happened before that, and what always occurs in all of this is afterwards, like, "We gotta do something about this. We gotta put some brakes in it. We gotta deal with it," and then we immediately take them off, and then it happens again. So it just continues to boom and bust like that. And here is what I think is occurring. And history feels this way in terms of its cyclical nature. These things are always working together, and unfortunately, they have some really predictable elements to them. There's a recipe to it, right? There's the boom and bust of the markets. There's also the amount of inequality. There's the perception of reality that we were talking about earlier. Also, it really helps if there's some sort of an environmental disaster or crisis that plays into it. Like every time you see one of these big changes, there's always some sort of environmental thing or disease, right? Whether it's a climate change takes place in the Roman Empire, you have the end of feudalism that takes place with the Black Death. You know, it's back and forth. All these things sort of combine. I think what's happening right now, and it's pretty predictable, unfortunately, is that we're reaching another existential crisis that combines all of these elements. We're probably going to have some sort of an economic major problem or malfunction because it can't continue like this. It doesn't work. I mean, like you see it left and right. Like people are not just stretched thin. They can't buy houses anymore. Like the single family housing market is pretty much gone. People can't afford rent anymore. Eventually, at some point or another, that metabolizes into a labor movement, which we're having right now. Like it's not reported on, it's not dealt with, but you're seeing a lot of people organizing and gaining power in those regards. You start seeing social movements that start rearing their heads. We've seen Occupy, we've seen Black Lives Matter, and there's a tons of other ones that come out. Eventually, it's that authoritarianism we were talking about earlier. It starts to grow and worm its way into our lives. You brought up New York City. You can barely get on a subway car right now in New York City for like troops going through your things, right? Thousands of troops and cops who are like, carrying out what are arguably unconstitutional search and seizures. Then on top of it, if you do happen to get into a car, you might either get attacked or killed or who even knows, right? Like the fabric of society is starting to disintegrate a little bit. So as that happens, you're going to see a clash between, I think, what is a resurgent left and a powerful right. The question now, which is the question at all times, all you have to do is go back into the 1960s, 1970s, in which you had another moment like this, which is, are you going to see enough people who are willing to put their lives and safety on the line? And for a while, they were doing it because of things like the Vietnam draft, which is where, in order for the business of empire and state to continue, it's going to take blood to grease the wheels, right? Well, guess what? A lot of the social movements that era, they came to a stop, particularly the anti-war free speech movement, whenever the draft went away, right? The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, they had their moments. But eventually, it all got codified into consumerism. All of a sudden, everybody starts wearing blue jeans. They go into rock and roll concerts, and you have hippies that go to yuppies, right? It gets commercialized and sort of absorbed. The question we have to ask now is, are all the projects that are going to amplify state power, including artificial intelligence, surveillance, robots, all the drones, right? All these things that amplify state power, is it going to create an environment in which protesting or being an activist is going to put your life on the line? Probably. So are we going to see enough people who are going to put their shoulder to the wheel, or are we going to basically retreat into personalized boutique realities? Virtual reality, social media, working from home, never seeing other people, the decline of communities. Are people going to say, you know what, things out there are ugly, I'll stay behind my closed door and I'll just go ahead and have my life as long as I can have it? We don't know. But it seems like as time moves forward that that's the chessboard that's being set up. And I personally have hope. I know that I've gotten a reputation for being a little bit of a prophet of doom, and I know that these conversations aren't always fun. I personally, from looking at history, I have hope and I'm optimistic that lower D democratic forces are going to prevail. But I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that this isn't going to be ugly. This is going to be really, really ugly in a lot of different ways, and I don't think it's going to. I don't think it's simply going to solve itself. I think it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of blood, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, then there's the other analysis. I think it would be interesting if you could check out this John Michael Greer book, which I think it was from 2019, Dark Ages America, because
Mhm.
basically, his perspective. Also, another book that I did a podcast with him recently. Also, Jem Bendell, who
Mhm.
wrote a book Breaking Together. kind of their argument based on their assessment of what's happening with energy and resources, is it's actually not going to be possible to maintain these gigantic, federated imperial systems,
Yep.
and ultimately power is just going to start to devolve back to the localities and regions as people have to deal with whatever is happening.
Well, we're already seeing that. I mean, globalism, and that's another part of the story. Globalism is unwinding. Like it reached its zenith, and now it's coming back. There's a reason why America is now investing in manufacturing. The reindustrialization of America, I think, is going to create a labor struggle, the likes of which we've never seen, because China's now the Cold War enemy, right? And we also have a federal government that has been completely depowered. The most powerful people in the United States now are governors. Like they are the ones who basically control what happens in your daily life. I don't think that that's outside the possibility that it could become much more regionalized and localized. I think that's even sort of what the oligarchs and plutocrats that we were talking about earlier. I think that's even what they're counting on. I think that's the real possibility.
I mean, obviously, I liked in your book, you talked about how, I mean, you mentioned the reality is that, it was America that kind of destroyed the sort of hopeful possibility of the USSR falling apart by sending in the Milton Friedman neoliberal economists who convinced all those countries that they had to privatize all their state-owned, kind of institutions as quickly as possible, sell them off to the highest bidder, which led to kleptocracy, which then led to Putin, which now led to this, really difficult situation where you have a religious fanatic psychopath, with 3,000 nuclear weapons that he might decide if he's going to die, he just wants to go out in a blaze of global destruction. We just don't know. I mean, it's a psychological issue there.
I think that right there was the beginning. I say all the time, I said the Cold War wasn't won. There were two mortal wounds that were suffered. It just so happens that the USSR bled out first. The United States unleashed on the world not just neoliberalism, but also an autocratic energy that has now metastasized into a right-wing authoritarian movement. I mean, Putin's not in control of it, but he's one of the major nodes of it, and it's mobster style kleptocracy, and that's what the United States is also becoming. And I think that's absolutely right. I think that more or less sort of unleashed a poison into the system that has now sort of circled back around.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to be careful because sometimes when when you get into the more like leftist analysis,
Mm.
you end up blaming Europe, and America for everything.
Sure.
Chomsky style, which I also think everybody has, their own homegrown style of evil. We just happen to be, in the lucky position to extract, the bulk of the world's energy and resources, for a considerable period.
I would make the argument, and I think this is one of the things that the left misses out on a lot of the times. I don't think it's that the United States is an inherently evil country. Countries are countries. They can either be good or bad at any given moment. Certainly, the founding of the United States was evil, not just settler genocide, but also the framing of the Constitution. I think the bigger thing here is that we've missed the point that capitalism is a parasite. And it
Yeah.
jumps from nation to nation, eating them up and destroying them from the inside out. The United States was passed the baton of capitalism from Great Britain. After World War II, the United States took over, and as a result, it was co-opted by a parasite. And now the parasite's done with us. You brought up the lack of new markets and George W. Bush. Like, that's why we went to Iraq. We opened it up as a new market. And it didn't serve the United States because capitalism had taken the reins. It had, the parasite had effectively taken control of the body. So, yeah, I think it's actually reductive to simply say the United States does this or Russia does that. I think it actually misses the larger mark, which is capitalism is itself an entity that has more or less sort of jumped and moved and caused these things to happen. I think that's the larger critique that needs to be focused in on.
Yeah. Well, I guess the point I was trying to get to was, so we missed our opportunity maybe with the USSR, and then allowed for, some people would say it's like a nemesis that we helped create or whatever. But the problem really from the tragic situation that we're facing now, which you do allude to a little bit at the end of the book, although it's not a main focus, is it looks like we're at a period where climate change is not just going sort of linearly up, but is curving more exponential. As all the feedback loops in the climate system and the biosphere engage. So 2023, we saw, unprecedented, warming of the oceans. Like scientists don't even know what's happening or why. Cherry blossoms are out now instead of May. It looks like we've shot past 1.5 degrees Celsius
Yep.
above pre-industrial levels to about 1.7. And yeah, there were a lot of, the IPCC was quite conservative in their estimates. That actually, what we didn't really look into, or the scientists didn't really go into, was how all these feedback loops would come together. So now we may be in a period of like 10 or 20 years, until, the climate, or even less, becomes very, very unlivable for, a lot of people in different parts of the world, particularly the global south. And so it's at the time when we actually would need global coordination and connection. We've instead got into this modality of, the new Cold War between, Russia, the West, US, and China. And yeah, I mean, it seems to me like the best thing that would, I mean, Robert Wright, I don't know if you know him.
Yep.
He wrote a book, Non-Zero. He's quite good, actually. He wrote a piece recently about how, yeah, sanely, the US should be trying to make peace with China right now and just figure out how we go forward, because, this could, easily become, a scale of like billions of people dying in the
Yep.
next 20 years, and there's nothing within, imperial modernity, imperial, capitalism that's going to make that, that's going to stop that,
No, there's nothing about it, and there's no possibility for it within that framework. I think it's actually amazing. And first of all, I think Xi Jinping is a murderous dictator. This
Yeah.
is not at all a Chinese apology. Like they've tried to work with us, even as the saber rattling has grown. There have been moments in which like they've tried to lower the temperature. But the American xenophobic, white supremacist, capitalistic sort of regime has no ability whatsoever to work with them. It just can't happen. The only thing they can do is have corporations, including the tech oligarchs, they go in and work with them, right? Sort of like the tentacles of capitalism that can go in and take what they can and are more than fine again with the authoritarianism we were talking about. This is a death spiral. There is no way whatsoever under the current climate that climate change is going to be dealt with. And so what's actually happening right now, I think, is a precursor to where things are going. The extremism of right-wing authoritarianism, I think, is actually preparing the ground for what is going to happen. And this is one of those things. I think the right wing is in denial about global climate change because ideologically they have to be, right? Because their project is to continue extraction and oppression. But I do think that they feel it and they know it. I think a lot of what's happening with immigrants and refugees right now is more or less an acting out of what will eventually happen if climate change is allowed to hit us and we have not had a cultural sea change. If you think things are bad right now with people being put in camps, families being separated, I mean, in Georgia, there's been forced hysterectomies. I mean, if you think any of that is bad, imagine as our land starts to shrink and our resources start to shrink. It's the equivalent of a fascist being in charge of like a boat that is on fire, and the fascist tells you that the smoke isn't there, we're not actually on fire, and then the moment it becomes unavoidable that there's a fire, all of a sudden it's time for the person who denied it in the first place to make the split-second cruel decisions about what you do, who survives and who doesn't. And so I believe America is preparing itself for that, if not unconsciously, in a way that should frighten everybody. I think what we're seeing right now from Trump with MAGA is an unconscious preparation, and I think it's only going to get worse unless we have some sort of a sea change.
Yes. I mean, I'm actually living on a block right now where all these refugee asylum seekers are gathering every day, because they turned an abandoned school, on the Catholic school on the corner, into a shelter processing center.
Mhm.
And then they just sit in the park, so it's like hundreds of these, young guys mostly from, these countries that are already collapsing in the global south, like Ivory Coast. Then you read that it's actually like, 80% deforestation because of cocoa. They grow 50% of the world's chocolate, and the Nestle's and Hershey's work with the corrupt government, which gets like 5% of the revenue. And these guys who work on the chocolate farms, which is dangerous work, get paid 78 cents a day. So and even then they're starving. So they're you have 50 million people in Central and West Africa on the verge of starvation, and some of them are just finding ways to march, somehow to get over to Brazil and then just march north or get over to Colombia or whatever. And so this is just a trickle of what could be coming. Yeah, I mean, apparently you could resettle 2 billion people in Canada. I'm not sure if Canadians are going to be crazy about that. But it looks like maybe at some point that's just people are going to be on the move, like in mass quantities. And
I think what we've already seen, and to be fair, and this is something that never gets brought up in any of this, the reason why we're dealing with these people from the global south is because the global structure has completely, dominated and destroyed the global south. It has continually undermined them and undermined their political and economic structures. So these are the consequences of our action. That's not a popular thing to say out loud, but that's how we've arrived at this point. There are going to be so many people who are going to move when it comes to the consequences of global climate change, and eventually, it's not going to get to the. I to be honest, you saying the idea of resettling 2 billion in Canada is maybe the most optimistic thing that I've heard about this in a long while. But if you look at it rationally from what has happened, we're talking genocide. That's what we're literally talking about. We're getting to the point where we are setting up for an industrialized genocide. The
sure,
the
we'll
likes
have the robots, the AI robot drones, which will just be doing this, I mean, yeah, it's really it's terrifying.
And we have been told, and this is one of the unfortunate things, and I think this is important to point out. We have created this narrative and reality in which fascism, Nazism was just a phenomenon of 20th century Western Europe.
Yeah,
We don't know what happened. A guy got up and made speeches and they were too good. Instead of recognizing that these are inherent conditions of humanity that we have to fight and deal with, and also that capitalism, feeds and stokes. And I think America, particularly in the place where it's at and what is happening, particularly with decline and what we've been discussing this entire time, like it is being set up to deal with the consequences of its imperialist actions through more and more furious violence. And unless we have something that changes that, unless we have some sort of a redirection, it's almost faded at this point. And I don't say that to scare people. I say that because we actually need to wrestle with that. We need to look in the face of it, understand where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm looking at what's happening in Haiti right now.
yeah.
And I think the right wing is going to just bleed that for all the fear mongering it can. Well, as somebody who wrote the Midnight Kingdom, and I look at how Haiti played into 18th century America and their fears about, slave revolts. You look at the pre-Confederacy Confederacy and how it fed into their fears of slave revolts and eventually, their revolution against the country. Like all of this is cyclical, and it's very, very clear where this is going, and we can go ahead and chart it if we just pay attention.
There is an end to the cycle in some respects, which is the decline of cheap energy,
Yes.
uh, which keeps the whole thing in motion. So if we don't develop something like fusion power, which still seems very much like a pipe dream, we're not, there's no way, the whole idea that renewable energy can maintain this type of system, particularly since all the industrial farming, is fossil fuel dependent. Um,
I saw something. It was I don't know if you saw this. It was a couple of months ago. There was this big hubbub on Twitter where someone, I believe it was Matt Christman, suggested that for a sustainable future we might have to give up bananas. And people are like, "What are you talking about? We shouldn't be saying that out loud." And it's like, I love bananas. I'll eat a banana after we're done here. I don't care. And like, but that's such a small thing to have to give up. And in American culture, what we've actually bartered for, it's multiple types of Reese's cups.
yeah.
It's Ruby Tuesdays. Like it's such a ridiculous thing that we've given up a sustainable, better, more equal future for, and we're going to have to do that. Like it's not going to be necessarily a decline. It's going to be what a lot of people are afraid of. And if you listen to American apocalyptic narratives, they're afraid of becoming a second world nation, something that other people already live with. Some, other people's realities are based in. And like it's going to be giving up some of the conveniences, which by the way, some of are really not all that important. And I think that's what we're struggling with, which is actually consumer choices. I think that's what a lot of people are dealing with.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it may go deeper than that down the line, but I wanted to, we've been talking for a bit, but maybe we start to wind up. But I really enjoyed talking to you, and
Sure.
we should keep up conversation, do more
Sure.
things together. Really enjoyable. I wanted to get into one idea that I really appreciated from the Midnight Kingdom. I think this is after maybe you're talking about your grandmother towards the end. Okay, the self-styled messiahs of big tech offer digital and futurist salvation. That's only another mythology, promising a future. In the cosmos or the virtual world is just distracting from pressing problems and allowing the concentration of wealth and extraction of resources to continue unabated. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, these untenable solutions proliferate what I've come to think is a very general but costly mistake. The concept of sin powered Christianity, led to systems of spiritual and economic domination, rationalized modern slavery and genocide, inequality, supplied the self-interested core of capitalism, and inspired conspiracy theories and a general distrust that makes collective action nearly impossible. But it was never real. Like the devil, which I learned to fear as a supernatural external threat, I guess in your childhood as an evangelical, it was a projection of internal guilt. That I found was really interesting. The powerful who manipulated the world and engaged in endless cruelties for their own benefit laid their own shame upon the rest of us and designed the systems that continued to benefit them accordingly around that lie. That frame contorted us, perverted us, turned us into twisted versions of them. And with that twisting, we projected it outward again and again and again. Yeah, I was curious if you wanted to just, explain that maybe in different terms or, what you're talking about there.
Sure. One of the things that I've come to understand in my next book project is actually looking at the psychological toll of capitalism and what it's actually done to us. Capitalism runs on the idea that we need to be told constantly that there's something wrong with us. And this is as simple as something like toothpaste. If we don't get the right toothpaste, we're not going to get the date. We're going to end up alone, right? We're going to get humiliated at work. We possibly could lose it. Product has become in some way or another something that we need to buy in order to make ourselves whole, right? And as a result, we have this entire pseudo environment, going back to who we were talking about earlier, a little bit about naming them. We have this entire pseudo environment where product is
Oops.
about fixing us. It's giving us something that we don't comes from the Christianity in order to bring ourselves idea. And what it does is kept us from believing that we deserve better. And that's part of the issue at this point. We have lost the ability to imagine that we deserve programs that take care of us, or even look after us, or we deserve a government that, keeps corporations in check. Instead, we have turned into a shame-based society, and a shame-based society does one thing, which is it projects its shame on other people, which is why you see Republicans constantly being exposed as hypocrites for saying that they're against something, and it turns out that that's who they are. And it turns into this cycle of self-immolation and self-abuse that we are not able to get away from. And that's why sin in Christianity has been such an essential component of the capitalist structure. And of course, liberals tried to get away from it. They tried to create, the valley between state and religion, but it's always been in that because ideologically and narratively, it's always been essential for this entire thing to work from the very beginning.
All right, cool. Why don't we stop on that note? That's a good note to stop. And we will pick it up again soon, I hope.
Yeah,
Uh,
this has been fantastic. It's been so nice talking with you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Have a great day in your secret hideaway from the white nationalists. I hope they don't find you. And stay safe and stay free, as my former friend Russell Brand would have said. And we'll talk soon.
That is the best goodbye I've ever heard. You stay safe as well.
Ciao, ciao.